Well, good afternoon and welcome to another FS Club webinar. And today we're discussing trade friction points, measuring contractual ecosystems with Sally Geyer, the Global Chief Executive Officer of World Commerce and Contracting, and Adrian Furner, a Fellow and Executive in Residence. And we're going to be seeing some very interesting research. Trade friction points, for those of us who've been involved in trade, myself as former master of the Worshipful Company of World Traders, are very interested in where are these friction points. We now have an entirely networked world, but we're somewhat frustrated by the lack of institutions, procedures, rules, and bureaucracy that seem to emerge. And what we're going to be looking at here is an intersection between a relational approach to contracting and digitisation that creates an ability to measure. I think certainly for me, going into this, measurement is one of the key themes. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli, I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these interesting webinars, but I can only do so thanks to what I call, quite rightly, the tolerance of our sponsors who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today we are really going to be looking at technology behind trade, the economics of trade, and the financing of trade as we look at how do we measure these relationships and make sense of them. And we have two presenters today, and so our agenda is still going to follow the usual format. Sally will be on initially for a bit to set the scene, and Adrian is going to be talking in detail about some very deep research that they've done, which is being presented on the website. So I'd like to point out three things, if I may. Firstly, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will go up in about 48 hours, so you might expect sometime Friday afternoon. Secondly, the slides are available. In fact, they're already up on the website. But thirdly, yes, this is interactive, and we're looking forward to your questions. Please type them into the GoToWebinar question facility. I'm here with you. I'm not on Teams or WhatsApp or getting emails. I'm here with you, Sally and Adrian. But if you feed them to me, I'll feed them into the 20 minutes of conversation we have at the end as question and answer. And a point for those of you, if the questions get fast and furious and there are too many, Adrian and Sally will be getting a copy of all of the questions with your email attached, and they can respond to you individually, particularly if you've got a particular point you'd like to have brought evidence to bear on, for example. Anyway, with no more ado, if I may, Sally, the floor is very much yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now, and that's been a seamless transition. And as Michael said, we're going to take you through a story about trade friction points. The agenda, briefly, we're going to give you an introduction. I will lead with the introduction and background to this. We'll talk about friction points and their importance. And then Adrian is going to talk to you deeply about a comparison that we used in the context of this study of 3 different accommodation booking platforms. So let's just start immediately with a background to this topic. Modeling the EU economy as an ecosystem of contracts. Honestly, when I heard that title and the objective, I was super excited. It confirmed for me that I really am a true contracts geek. But genuinely, I believe in the intelligence that contracting should be providing society. But today, that's rarely the case. Contracts are rich in data. We talk about contracts being sponges, taking in all of this intelligence. Somehow we need to make sense of that data, and we need to help it to connect different functions, legal, accounting, business. So the first study was published back in 2019. It was designed to establish whether or not modeling the EU economy as an ecosystem of contracts was even feasible, whether or not this was the right approach. The overwhelming conclusion was positive, and so that led to the second study, which sought to establish how this could actually be achieved based on the tools and technologies available to us today. I think what's also been fascinating is that this study spanned both sides of the pandemic. So we've been able to assess the importance of this approach in the wake of the disruption we've experienced. When COVID-19 struck globally, it created dramatic levels of economic and social disruption. Among those many things, the many impacts, it revealed the vacuous nature of today's contracts, the fundamental weaknesses in critical data flows, the absence of visibility into complex supply chains, and the fragmented nature of organizational design. So for business and commerce, the pandemic widened the cracks that were already becoming visible, but in many cases had just been ignored or dismissed as too difficult to fix. So what is the issue? Well, I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide, but let's say that the belief that politics, society, and economics are out of balance isn't new news. Concepts like the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit go back more than 25 years. But the truth is they've had limited impact. What we recognized was we need to measure things differently. There is an opportunity to do that. And we learned that even before the pandemic struck. But as I've said, the pandemic then reinforced the need for that. So I think everyone appreciates that our world has transitioned from one that's been, historically dominated by goods, by products, to a world that's dominated by services. It's a world that revolves far more around intangibles and on that basis, uncertainty. At the same time, technology is evolving and it's allowing us, it should be causing us to be far more expansive in our thinking about the future of contracts, the role that contracting can play to support data flows, to drive clarity, visibility, and to a degree certainty in the context of that intangible world. So, what do we mean by contracts are boundary objects? And now I get to indulge my geekishness again. The fact is that contracts today are not designed to drive positive behaviours. They're not designed to drive high quality data flows or communications. They're not even seen as operational guides for those who are charged with overseeing their performance. Instead, they seem to have an overarching purpose to ensure mutual understanding around a pretty narrow set of performance parameters and distribute risks of failure based on power dynamics that exist between the parties. So given this predominant model, it's not surprising that the overall interdependencies of supply and outcome are given limited attention. But warnings of supply fragility go back more than a decade. So it's this approach that ultimately left organizations blinded to the consequences of the pandemic, unable to predict supply disruptions, anticipate supply chain fragilities. This all became an urgent threat to business performance and capability. I think it was an article published in The Atlantic back in 2020 that said, coronavirus exposes the fragility of an economy built on outsourcing and just-in-time delivery. Contracts are and should be boundary objects. They are also economic instruments. First and foremost, they're economic instruments. You enter into a contract for financial benefit. Unfortunately, that fact has been overwhelmed by another purpose of contracts, which is around legal enforceability. Contracts serve many purposes, and as a consequence, they become confused and confusing. They can be used by particular groups to support specific interests. The fact is, research by World Commerce and Contracting found that almost 90% of business users find contracts difficult or impossible to understand. So they sit in a drawer. They suck and absorb information, and instead of disseminating that intelligence around the business, they sit and frankly serve very little purpose at all. So let's now I hope that has provided you with a very brief and high level overview of why we went about conducting this study, why I got very excited about it. And now I'm going to hand over to Adrian, who's going to take us on a little bit of a deeper journey over the next 10-15 minutes, looking at how we can unearth that intangible side of the economy via contracts. Adrian.
Thanks, Sally. I feel I've got a real challenge. It's a bit like doing the works of Shakespeare in 10 minutes here. You know, there is a much bigger set of reports that you'll find in the links at the end of this presentation. I'm going to take you on a journey to give you that sort of potted explanation of where we went, because you know, when you pick up a project like this, you think, where do you start? And it was really great to work with a really good multidisciplinary team, including the European Commission on this, because we started over at the right hand side with this graph. If you imagine the European economy as this connection of interconnected contracts, we're very aware that you can have the same transaction with the same contracts, even between possibly the same people, but the value that comes out of the end of the transaction is not necessarily the same. And you know, if you work across from that graph on the right hand side, if you added up the value, the economic value ascribed to each contract, you wouldn't necessarily get to the GDP of the European economy. There are things that adjust that contract value. So if you work back across, we came up with two kind of coefficients to test, you know, the impact of a relationship from transactional to relational on the value that comes out, and what we called the connectedness. So the use of a platform, how well connected were those two nodes? And we wanted to really test this banner across the bottom of what's the impact of velocity on the value generated from a contract. So this brings us to the challenge of friction points, as we called them. And friction points to us are activities in the contracting life cycle that affect its velocity. And there are many friction points throughout the life cycle that's on the diagram in the sort of center left there, from initiation of an idea through to negotiation, implementation, and then closeout. And individually and collectively, these friction points can either add or erode to the value of the outcomes. So a couple of very simple examples from the World CC research. We believe that lack of clarity of scope and goals can erode value as you move through the contracting life cycle. So spending more time, creating more friction around understanding the clarity of the scope and goals can drive more value. Equally, in the negotiation phase, spending too long point scoring between the parties is a negative impact on a negative friction, and therefore negatively it affects the outcomes. So these things, it isn't always about faster velocity or faster speed equals better value. It's about optimizing that velocity throughout the life cycle. Now, it'd be nice if the world was simple, but our research shows that in a typical contracting life cycle, there are more than 40 friction points that you've got to balance as you go forward. And there's a report there with a reference with more detail on that piece of research that we did. What we've tried to do is create simplicity in a complex world. What you see here is the mapping of those sort of 40-ish friction points. We've mapped them on buy side and sell side because they occur at different points. There are different friction points depending on whether you're buying or selling in the process. And therefore we've tried to create, and what we believe we've created here is a simplified view of those friction points, but one that's scalable, and that was what we wanted to test through this research. Equally, on the next slide, what we wanted to do when we looked at platforms and their impact on velocity was we inserted not just buy side and sell side, but we looked at what's the role of a platform in terms of friction. And what we found was actually that in the pre-signature phases, a platform is really about increasing the velocity of getting to agreement. And post-signature, it's about increasing the efficiency of delivery. So just bear that in mind. Equally, platforms don't have to be just digital. They can be non-digital or analog platforms. For example, a framework agreement that brings a group of people onto a common contracting approach, a common governance approach can be a platform. So do just bear in mind that increase in velocity up to signature and increased efficiency of delivery post signature when we're going through this case study around the accommodation booking platforms. So why did we pick accommodation booking platforms? Well, firstly, I guess everyone on this call has used them. We all understand what they are. They're easy to explain. We can all visualize how they work. Equally, there are different kinds of booking platforms. We may not think about it when we're using them, but there are, we've found 3 distinct models of platform here, and it's not about us saying one is better than the other. It's about a comparison between them to understand the impact on velocity of different kinds of platforms. It was about testing that friction point model on something that is business to consumer, not just business to business. And it was the aim to understand the role and impact of the relationship, the platform design and user experience, the contract and terms, and as we said, the friction points and velocity in a transaction. So just before we dive into the detail, let's look at the 3 models that we focused on. The first one at the bottom there, a local intermediary. This was a hotel, cottages.com is a company that does bookings of holiday accommodation in geographically focused areas. It's a far more human-centric approach. So if you own a holiday property and you want to get it on their platform, they provide a person to help you do that, to find the right images, to create your presence on their booking platform. And it's more local focused. We then looked at a global intermediary, and someone like Expedia is an example here. And what they do is they hook into the booking platforms of airlines, of hotel companies, and they act as an intermediary to bring together the data that is held in the airlines and the other host booking platforms. And when you go and search it, it goes back into their system and pulls that information forward, consolidates it, and gives you that consolidated view. The final type, like Airbnb, we called a global infomediary, because here their reservation platform has been designed to be the platform that all of the hosts put their data on. So it provides an end-to-end integrated, controlled user experience to reduce friction points. It provides end-to-end digitisation to allow data capture, flow, and use. And it really is about self-service by both guests and hosts. So as you can see, each of these platforms is subtly different from the other ones and gave us 3 real alternatives to have a look at. So let's see what we did with that. So firstly, the first part of the research we did was about mapping the infomediary platform. And what you can see here is a very simplified process map of what a host does, what a guest does, and then the role of the platform and the different activities that happen as you go through the life cycle. The kind of things that came out of this is the importance, the role of the platform here, if we jump to the next slide, is to act as controlling the payment. That's how they control elements of it. If you go into the terms and conditions, Airbnb is a payment processor in large sense. That's where it sits. Equally, if you look at how Airbnb has developed over the last few years, a lot of the developments have been around enhancing this trusted environment, such that users are willing to put their data onto this platform and allow that data to be used by the infomediary for the benefits of different players. So, for example, you'll see that host ID verification has become more rigorous over the last few years, so that each of the hosts knows who they're dealing with, and the guest knows that the host is who they say they are. Equally, in the post-stay activities, the resolution center, the reviews approach is all about creating trust. So what does that create? If we jump to the next slide, we wanted to understand the user experience. So what we did was a mixture of subjective and objective analysis. We created a group of people who went in with a standardized guest booking, and they assessed the user experience, the level of friction and velocity, the user outcome, the nature of the level of trust that they felt. And all of this is in a white paper and a report that will give you the link at the end. But just by way of some quick insights as to what that gave us. Firstly, on the next slide, it's about trust, both perceived and evidence, can enhance velocity. Whether that's the rating that a host or a guest has, whether it's the tag of a super host, which gives credibility that the platform gives. Equally, the role of the images is fundamental to speeding people through that transaction, such that they trust the images, the information that the platform is providing them, so they can get to agreement and booking much quicker. The second point, standardization, plays into this user experience again. If you jump from one property to another, things are laid out in a common way. You can assess the information you're being provided, which gives that perception of trust again and experience and enhances the velocity. And our very simple user experience showed that people move to booking a lot quicker in this kind of environment. The third one's a really interesting one. Negotiation is not always in a traditional sense, because you can't negotiate necessarily, other than in certain circumstances, the terms that you're booking on. However, negotiation in the context of Airbnb and probably some of the other platforms like this are you choose one property over another. So negotiation is very different. It's about choosing and choice, and therefore how you position your offering versus another offering in the platform. The fourth one there, each participant has an intangible balance sheet. This is really important because when we come back and we look at the European economy, increasingly this concept of the intangible balance sheet is really important, whether that's your guest rating, both the rating you get of a numerical 0 to 5, and also the number of reviews you have, which changes versus other platforms, because if they're more active, they get more reviews. And if they've got the same score as you, but more reviews, that has an impact on what the guest is potentially thinking. And the final one, a platform, a value-adding platform, is not just an accident, it's a conscious design. Airbnb have invested, and other platforms have invested heavily in creating the platform and finessing their platform. So we have to get better at these kind of things if we want to really leverage the learning from this. We also did some modeling on the Airbnb approach, because Airbnb, through the inside Airbnb dataset, allowed us to create some simplistic agent-based modeling where we calibrated it on the reviews over 10 years in Amsterdam. So you had significant numbers of guests, hosts, and reviews, which were a proxy for contracts. That allowed us to really create a model and verify that model and test it against the real world data set to then look at analyzing the net value of the network, number of participants in the network, the inequality between buyers and sellers. So a lot more detail about this simplistic model in the report, so I won't go into it. Equally, we had, as I said, a multidisciplinary team who allowed us to look at the how we visualize some of these really detailed graphs. As Sally said, the pre-pandemic versus the post-pandemic. We started to look at not just one city, but scaling it up to 7 cities. What could we do with the visualization there? And also looking at the sentiment analysis in the reviews. So very much, really looking at some forward-looking technologies of how do we analyze and visualize complex data sets to allow us to find some of these different trends within them. So Sally, at this point, I will hand back to you to look at this challenge of how do we scale it?
Absolutely. So Adrian, thank you for that whistle-stop tour. And the purpose of this study was really to try and support a dynamic visualization of the economy through contracts, such that it's going to help policymakers go beyond GDP. And I think what's interesting is when we look at our world dominated by the internet, by technology giants, a huge challenge for the European Commission in this context and other policy and regulatory bodies is the fragmentation, inaccessibility of data and the inconsistency of current indicators to support legislative and decision-making activities across this huge range of policy areas. Even in assessing the impact of change in rules can be challenging in this context. So much of this has been about the current ways of measuring economies. GDP has been an effective reporting tool, but as we've talked about, it doesn't cover everything. It's good, but it's not good enough. It's anchored in our past environment of product and service, and it struggles to account for the intangible structures and assets of today's economies. So to create a better framework for policy making and monitoring, data needs to be leveraged. We need to create this consistency, this stack that allows levels of standardization. We need to create these economic indicators that are enhanced by platforms, by the networks, and this contract information that can better model modern economies. So we need an update of methodologies. We need to leverage the technology that is available to us. And our overall objective is to make measurable and visible the way intangible assets and data should be accounted for in this context in a European ledger of value. But of course, this is a study conducted at that level. We're certainly looking at this with a much broader and more expansive global view. There's a lot of work still to be done. This remains, of course, very much work in progress, but we're excited. The European Commission were incredibly positive about the publication of the second report. As we have mentioned, we welcome any of you who'd like to review those reports. There are links here, and those links will be shared with you and available to you. And with that, Michael, I think we will stop and hopefully make time for some questions.
That's super. Both Sally and Adrian, thank you very much. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions. People do get your questions, comments, observations in, but I'll start with a few that we've already received. Hugh Purser is curious, a key relationship in economic activities between the employer and the employee. Did you research employment contracts?
That's really interesting. We didn't specifically research employment contracts in the context of this European Commission study, but I can briefly say that we do a lot of work and research in the context of employment contracts under the auspices purely of world commerce and contracting. There's fascinating studies and design and simplification. I've talked about the vacuous nature of contracts and the fact that they're very much often unusable. Most lay people can't understand them, and that's true for employment agreements as well. There's a huge movement now around design and simplification, even studies and stories around things like the design of comic contracts for farm labourers, fishermen, to create that environment of effectiveness and efficiency in the workforce and a far stronger relationship because of the level of transparency that exists in that context. So there's some wonderful case studies around how to create better relationships, better efficiencies, better productivity when you change simply the nature of the contract.
Great. Iva Luijendijk is curious, if we talk about velocity and friction points, where do we see the role of automated business in order to minimize the impact of these friction points? For instance, smart contracts via blockchain that are supposedly predictable, transparent, and unreputable. Do you consider these to be platforms?
Yeah, I do, and I can't wait for smart contracts to take over. I suspect they're going to be called something different, but Adrian, why don't you take that particular question?
Yeah, there's a real opportunity for us here, and if you go to the Open Trust Fabric website, we've done some writing on what's called Ricardian contracts. which is the mixture of prose with metadata with code. Some elements of contracts are more easily codified, and therefore we should move faster on those elements in a lot of the research we do, we believe. Equally, creating metadata points so we can measure the efficiency of the process, the life cycle, and the effect of the life cycle. Today, there are some elements where prose will probably remain the way of actually documenting it. But if you look at Airbnb, actually, we did a bit of research. We looked at their terms and conditions. So I believe I'm probably one of the only people in the world that's read the Airbnb and the Expedia terms and conditions, sad as that is. It wasn't easy, I can assure you. And I doubt anyone reads the terms and conditions until something goes wrong, sadly, which is not the right way to use a contract. But what it does show is actually in the B2C market, we are quite happy to transact without a written contract in front of us and signing a written contract. The platform allows a codified contract to take place in effect. And in thousands and thousands of, or if not millions of transactions on Airbnb, we're already in that world of codified trading.
Well, it's interesting you move into the Ricardian contract space, which is fascinating. And in fact, we're hopefully going to be having a session with the worshipful company of arbitrators quite soon about where does arbitration fit in, because you seem to be balancing across this the almost the hardness of a formal contract with the reality of life, which is we work in relationships, and you spoke about framework contracts, etc. And this leads me on, I think, to another comment from Hugh Purser. 80% or more of many contracts, the contract that just seems to be box ticking, backside covering clauses, supposedly minimizing risk, but the small minority of the contract is about the true commercial arrangements. And this is especially true for Hugh in the world he works in, which is the world of intellectual property licensing. Any comments on how I measure what you might call the real contract fit from the boilerplate stuff?
Yeah, I think, again, Adrian, I know you'll have something to add to this. It is really interesting. And we look at contracts in the context of what we refer to as active clauses and passive clauses. It's the passive clauses that really tend to actually, frankly, be irrelevant until something goes wrong. It's the limitation of liability, it's the warranties, the indemnities, it's those things. But it's those that seem to take precedence in the context of negotiations, for example. So we have this perception that that is the larger part of the contract, yet actually our analysis shows that typically, and talking on averages here, it's the kind of 80-20 split, that actually 20% of the contract is passive clauses, 80% of the contract actually is about active, it's operational guides. And I often talk about the fact that we contract for the marriage, we contract for the divorce, I'm sorry, not for the marriage. We're contracting assuming that everything's going to go wrong, and our focus is all about how can we push risk onto the other side and how can we cover our own backsides precisely. Yet what we need to do is shift that mentality. And I talk about contracts needing to be, we need to stop using that language. We need to call them operational guides, and we need to bring those active clauses to the front where they actually become useful. Those are that's the intelligence, that data that needs to be shared around organizations in order to operationalize what is embodied in the contract. That's why I'm excited about the smart contracts and what we can do, because actually a lot of then the activities that need to happen, it's all automated. You don't actually need humans involved. If a service level it isn't met, an automatic credit gets made. This can all just happen automatically, and I see that as an exciting future as far as what we call contracting today. I think it might be called something else in a few years' time. Adrian, do you want to sort of comment on that as well?
Yeah, you've just taken us, neatly segued into, these are great questions, because these are the kind of discussions that came out when we were going through this research, which made it so interesting when you get a multidisciplinary group together from economics, the law, technology, really vibrant discussions, and that's how we're going to solve some of these big issues. But we've been doing quite a lot of work around uncertainty management and really becoming more tolerant of uncertainty in a rapidly changing world. And what Sally talks about there about the automation element is a world where we have relative certainty, perhaps we can move quicker there. At the other end of the spectrum, where we have lots of uncertainty, where we need creativity and so on, there's a different opportunity perhaps for us. And we've been doing some work again around the combination of the contract, the governance, and the relationship. And we were lucky to have Ugo Sahin, who's the CEO and founder of BioNTech, as part of our academic forum last year. And in listening to him and in interacting with him, looking at the journey on which they went for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, it started off, the relationship was fundamentally important between the CEOs. They had dinner, they agreed they wanted to work together, they didn't know how they were going to solve the problem. They built a bit of governance around it, some 7 pillars of governance of how their teams were going to work. So as they moved into the research phase, the governance became important, but the relationship was still there. There was a bit of contract, there was some memorandum of understanding. And then as they got to success, the regulators approved their vaccines. They had to work out how did they scale it up and produce billions of vials of the vaccine. At that point, the contract was really important. Who was going to produce them, on what basis, and how were they going to share the rewards, the licensing agreement. So the contract was really important, but you still had the governance there and you still had the relationship. So increasingly, it's not just about the contractual attributes, it's about the governance framework and the relational capabilities. We've got to look at all of those and how do we bring them together and accept they're going to be at different levels of priority, when we're at different levels of uncertainty to drive success.
And just to wrap up on that, sorry, Michael, just very briefly to wrap up and say, we need to start looking at the contract as the scaffolding for the relationship. Up until now, really, they've just operated independently of one another. But increasingly, we need to look at how do we create contracts that really do support the right relationships and the relationships that we need.
Yeah, well, I did like your point earlier about prenuptials, but let's not go there at the moment. I mean, you're raising a lot of good points here, and I can almost see that there's a need for a cluster analysis of contracts, so that, like Hugh's got his intellectual property contracts, we've got we've got sale and rental, we've got the Airbnb platform, we have raw supply, we actually have a lot of different types, and of course then there are different types of platforms that suit them. And I was just sort of curious, you've obviously picked up on the accommodation areas. In short, though, what's the transferability of what you've already seen to other platforms?
Yeah, I think, from my experience and what I've seen, there's a lot of transferability. The role of a platform, when you go up to that level, the role of a platform, I said, remember, the role of a platform is to increase the velocity to agreement and to increase the efficiency of delivery. If we can achieve that in whatever the context is, then we can drive extra value from the trading relationships that we put in place. Which then takes us back to that balance of the relational coefficient with the connectedness coefficient. And I think those are applicable when you're thinking about designing a platform. If you design it well, you can achieve those in whatever context you find yourself in.
And do you see any difference between what I would call wholesale and retail? I mean, we've seen the evolution from the late 90s, people were discussing portals, and then they moved on to exchanges, and now we call them platforms. It's all fine, a nice evolution of jargon, but the truth is everybody's been trying to make money out of it. But I see I don't know how to explain it, but a cultural difference between wholesale platforms and retail, and I would argue these accommodation platforms are very much on the retail side.
Yeah, I mean, Adrian, do you have a view on that?
I think we'll see digital platforms, the blurring between the two. I was doing some research this morning around the automotive industry and looking at some of the challenges, the economic challenges and shifts we're seeing, particularly in the US automotive sector, where in a an inflationary environment, which is the first time we've had that for many years, actually there is a real pressure to constrain prices. And the relative power play between the OEMs and the lower tier suppliers is being challenged about where is the boundary between those. Equally, you've got the likes of General Motors taking a direct to consumer model increasingly. So they're now not just selling cars direct to consumers, they're looking to sell 45,000 spare parts direct to consumers, which then disturbs that balance of relationship between the consumer and their local garage who installs these parts. So I think there's some really interesting times, and I think we'll see a blurring between the retail and the wholesale markets, which is going to challenge the business models for all of the people in the ecosystems, I think.
I think and just sort of filling it up and concluding on that, you know, what the platforms are starting to do, and to your point, Adrian, is it's all about disintermediation. So you're creating this direct connection, and the platforms are enabling that in a way that you didn't have before. So I completely agree that, you know, I see the blurring as well.
Hugh again, and I've got a few questions here, so if we could be short, but he's curious, what are your thoughts on should all contracts have sunset clauses? You know, in other words, a well-defined endpoint or a well-defined renegotiation point?
I'm going to take my classic lawyer view. It depends. That's my short answer.
But I do think, picking up on that, it does depend, but there is increasingly a role for standards in contracting. And this is something that a lot of organizations, there seems to be a mindset that if it's not invented here, it's not been written by our organization, it's not necessarily the optimum. Whereas actually, from a lot of our research, there is an increasing desire to have some standards, whether it's at a sector level or at a community level or at a global level. And if we can help organizations move towards that, again, it's a better use of platform, because standards are platforms in effect.
We've got time for two quick questions. I think one is based on personal experience. I spent a lot of time in MOD, Ministry of Defense procurement, and I remember receiving a new guy who was going to come in and do procurement at the level, and first thing he was going to do was to reduce our, I forget, 3,000, 5,000 suppliers down to 50 or something. And I kind of looked at him and said, well, why is that a good thing? I thought the whole point behind procurement was I could find exactly the right product and service that I actually needed, and you should be facilitating that. But a lot of what you're talking about as platforms, if I was a large organization, I'd say that's what my procurement department is supposed to do.
Again, Adrian, having been a supplier into Ministry of Defence, maybe you'd like to take first.
Yes. Platforms, interesting. You know, framework agreements. I was involved in the framework agreement for technical services that the MOD tried to put in place, or did put in place. Yeah, I'll give them credit there. And that was originally trying to get 100 suppliers, and for it to be legally binding under European Commission laws, everyone had to sign up to the same terms and conditions. Now, within my company, there were some 20 to 40 individual business units signing up to this framework agreement, and they all had different views. So we started off by aligning our own internal views and then supporting the Ministry of Defence to get success on that. And they did get success. And over 3 iterations of that, they got up to, I think, 400 to 500 organisations signing up to the same terms and conditions. And there were benefits from that. However, coming back to that, you know, contract governance relationship, we had a good relationship, we had an okay contract, but the governance didn't allow them to unlock the benefit of the platform. They still went out and asked for the standard information from bidders that they could have got once and then not asked for it again, which would have sped up the process. Somewhere there was a disconnect in the governance in actually leveraging the power of the platform. So again, it comes back to getting that balance of the contract, the governance, and the relationship right in order to unlock some of the opportunities around this.
Well, you know, a lot of things in this sector, you know, we could go on about business interruption insurance and the scandals there and what that means for uncertainty in contracting and all sorts of stuff. But I just wanted to close. Sally, you raised early on about measuring GDP. And you can't be very long in this sector and not, of course, come across Ronald Coase, who basically says that, you know, contracting efficiency effectively defines the scale of the firm. And so a lot of people have said over the years that we would expect these platforms to reduce contracting costs and therefore increase the number of smaller firms. You don't need to be amalgamated. So I guess my question is, any musings that you might have, because I would argue that eBay, Amazon, etc., seem to have resulted in polarization rather than necessarily resulting in just smaller firms. They're also resulting in a handful of large ones. But a concluding thought from both of you, and then we'll really have to quit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Yes, I think, and I'm glad you mentioned Amazon, because I think it's a really good point. There are huge benefits to individuals that Amazon exists, and yet there are many cons against those pros as well. But I think there are other platforms that provide access directly to individual retailers, if you like, that you wouldn't otherwise get access to. So I think what we need to do is, and what this EU study was designed to do, is start understanding how you can take the data from these studies and from these organizations and actually start to policy make for the benefit of society in that context. And that is what we have to do. We cannot let these big platforms run away with themselves. We need to make sure they provide a positive output for society as well. Adrian.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And if you go to the report on the agent-based modeling, it's a topic we looked at there, because you do get these, and it did show, particularly if you look at Amazon, for example, which is further ahead in its evolution, you're now getting investment funds coming in and buying up sellers and creating super sellers, super hubs. And there's a really interesting dynamic that the agent-based modeling starts to bring out that will be probably something we look at going forward.
Well, Sally and Adrian, that was super. It's clearly ongoing research, and so we would hope that we will have you back with further insights. And I think you're absolutely right. It's time this was investigated. We've only scratched the surface. I wish we had more time to talk about some of the deeper network metrics, some of the problems to do. I mean, even on your Amazon one, Adrian, insurance again plays a part where people are offering, excluded from Amazon insurance, for example. Anyway, we do have to quit. So I've got 3 quick rounds of thanks, if I might. First, simply to thank our sponsors. Again, I hope that you found this was very much at the junction of technology, economics, and finance, and some fascinating research. Secondly, to thank you, the audience. Hugh again thinks we ought to perhaps be looking at an interesting research project on the Black economy as an ecosystem of mostly unwritten contracts. So there's a lot there. We just need to set up another Black Silk Road to do the analysis, I suspect. And I think a lot of us are going to find that smart contracts aren't quite all they're held out to be, but they will continue to be an interesting area. So lots in the future. Including a series of events coming up. We have one tomorrow, of course, as you will know, on global innovation and national interest. That should be absolutely thrilling, with David Bogle, Vice Chancellor of UCL. And we have 3 events coming up next week, so it's busy ahead. But my final thanks obviously go to Sally and Adrian. Both of you, thank you so much. You put a lot of preparation in here. I know you've done a lot of work, but boiling it down to 20 minutes was really important. And I hope it provokes the audience to research it further. And may we wish you all the best. And we'll give you our little platform's applause-o-meter, which is our Korean karmic clapper. So consider that applause if I could open the floodgates here. And we hope to have you back. Thanks again.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.